Okay. So, I wanted to talk about um, the realization that happens when you practice, or the insight that comes along when you practice for long enough. Or maybe for some people it might not be long, but an insight is an awareness of reality that transcends a person. So, like I explained before, you begin in this illusion of the person, identified with the mind and the ego and the thoughts and the story of the individual self. With enough practice, the almost like your identity, in a sense, is what it feels like in the beginning, shifts out the way, out of the person. And knowing that there is that reality intellectually is one thing, but experiencing it as a known insight is a different thing. And you realise that obviously you weren't the person. Your true self, let's put it in terms of true self, it's not really like that. It's not a self, it's not an entity. You could more easily describe it as a non-entity. You realise that this reality of the person is relative. So we are relatively real identities, relatively real form identities that we are very attached to and relate to fully. And the shift out shows you that it's more like one singularity, one infinite consciousness, one formless non-entity is temporarily expressing itself through these forms, these finite, ever-changing, impermanent forms. And you see that becoming so attached to this form in the beginning, the start kind of seemed, once insight happens, it begins to seem ridiculous and quite funny. That we were lost in this identification for so long, and obviously it's not true. Obviously the person is finite and impermanent, but we become so attached, and that's where all the problems come from. That's where all the suffering comes from. And you in a sense connect with your, let's put it this way, your true self, your true identity, And from that perspective of that true identity that totally transcends the person, that transcends time, it transcends the story and the narrative on all levels completely, and you realise that you are infinite. And all the questions, all the suffering, all that pain that comes from the identification with the person is seen through as an illusion. Like I said, an illusion that is relatively real. It's only real from the point of view of the person. The person is kind of trapped within these time-space parameters, and these form, this kind of dance with form, if that makes sense. But then you see that the body and the mind have accumulated these patterns, and a lot of these are patterns of suffering. And you see that the mind isn't just this mental narrative that goes along, you talk to yourself in the head. The mind, at least this is the case for me, seems to consist of multiple layers. So you've got this mental narrative, like you talk to yourself in your head. But then you've got the kind of emotional body that's lower than that and is connected to the mental narrative. So say, for example, right, you think a worrying thought or a painful thought, and then you feel that in the body, and then that's in the background, and every time you think of the thought, you might forget it for a while. You're interested in doing something, you're doing something, and you forget it for a while, and then you remember that thought comes back up, and then you feel it. But there's a different level. In the background, there's a kind of like underlying emotional thought. It's like a lower level of thought. It's like maybe a subconscious thought, but it's in the background and you feel it. It kind of taints your experience of life, especially with the negative ones that accumulate. You begin to see the ones that have formed in that level that stick, and they're there. And it's those kind of things that cause depression, or that kind of trigger those intrusive thoughts that come in on the surface level of thought. So there are different levels of this thought and emotion that go down, and those deeper ones seem to be ingrained. And when you disidentify from the person and move out, you begin to become aware of this, and you can see it. So I'm talking about like psychotherapy and psychology and stuff like that. I'm sure there are techniques that address these things, but they can't be tackled by more mind activity. They can't be tackled by, hard to describe this again, hard to describe. They can't be tackled by the mind. The mind isn't going to fix them. Maybe it can to a certain extent, but when you see them and you see through them, they become more transparent. You have not so much a picture, but you have an awareness. You turn your awareness to that, and it starts to dissolve on its own. On its own, it starts to dissolve, and it's released. And all these things you've been living with your whole life, released. And this is a process. This is a process that it releases over time. Practice. Every practice is going to work better for different people. The way I did it, constantly, as much as possible, bring your attention into the present moment. Don't think, this is the thing about the insight practices. A lot of the way it's encouraged online is by asking you ask a question of questions of the mind. You're turning the mind in on itself. If you're like me, that's going to confuse you. You're going to get caught up in thought. It's so simple. Presence. Bring your attention into the present moment. Don't label anything. Just observe, go deeper as much as possible. Build the habit. Observe the mind when it comes up. Observe it. Keep taking that step back. Keep taking that step out relentlessly, because it's going to take effort in the beginning. Effort all the time until that habit is built and you're in presence more than you're in thought. And for me, there came a point where there was this shift. And the shift is, it comes like a realization, a remembering, like a, not of the mind, but it's kind of like this, like, oh, that's what this was. This was an illusion. This is my true self. I remember. It's obvious. It's obvious. It's like remembering your true nature. It's like coming out of a dream. It's like waking up out of a dream and you're like, of course. Oh, of course. I remember now. I'm not the person. That's what it was like initially for me. I'm not a person. I'm not anything. And this is the point where the dread comes, because the person panics. What if I don't exist? What if I cease to exist? What if I die? Can I hold on to this person? Can I hold on to this life? What if I die and there's nothing? Just absolute nothing. Is that terrifying? It's only terrifying from the point of view of the person. But for me, it went through this process of terror. Me trying to be permanent. A person trying to be permanent. And it's always going to seem terrifying from the point of view of the person. But just let go. It's like waking up from a dream. And then when you wake up, you're still in the dream. But then you can appreciate. You can live your life knowing that that's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. It's okay. Don't be. It's the fear of death. That fear of death kind of underpins everything. The fear of impermanence is where a lot of this suffering comes from. But it doesn't need to be that way. You don't need all these fear and suffering, these problems. It doesn't have to be that way. You can exit all that. You can get out of all that. And you can live your life free of this horrible background suffering, anxiety, fear, all that kind of stuff that follows you around. It's deep in your emotional body, this heaviness. It doesn't have to be like that. Sometimes that's interesting, sometimes whatever it is that's identified with this form, that's just a process that has to happen, and you have to go through that. It's an experience. It's a very intense and interesting experience, this identification, but that process, but it doesn't have to be like that. And all the questions, all the existential questions about the nature of reality and philosophy don't matter anymore. But presence, be present as much as possible. Initially, relentlessly, and no labelling, just observe. That's all that it took for me. and it seems like it's happening automatically now. It seems like I'm not applying the effort. It's just deepening and deepening, and the layers are just coming off, and I'm not in control of it anymore. And if you've been practicing for a while and you're struggling and you're thinking, I keep going back into the mind, I keep identifying, I'm doing really well for a while, but then I go back into the person, I can tell you that it's going to happen. The shift is going to happen. It will happen. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe when you die, that's when it will happen. I don't know. But if you're practicing already and you have that question in your mind, or that intention, or that pull towards this, it's going to happen. You don't really have any control over it. The process has already begun. The awakening, you're starting to wake up. It will happen. It's inevitable. Don't fight it. Don't apply effort. Don't strive. All you need to do, bring that attention and awareness into the present moment with an openness. Be open. Be here. Release. Accept everything. Don't label anything. Don't think about it. Just this. Just this. Constantly. Always just this. And the insight will come.